I appreciate you tuning in. I'm going to start quickly by acknowledging some co-authors on this work listed on the slide. Joel Camp is a PhD student here at the University of Maine. Stephen Dunham completed his master's work on this project. And Daniel Harrison is my co-PI on the project and a professor here in the Department of Wildlife. And then I'll also recognize the University of Maine, Maine Outdoor Heritage Fund, Maine Cooperative Forestry Research Unit, and Maine Inland Fisheries and Wildlife as funders of this work. I'll start off with, I've always really liked this quote by John James Audubon. When Audubon was working on his seminal Birds of America text, he made a trip to Maine, an expedition really, and he went to Dennisville, Maine, which is in the down east portion of the state, and states here that this bird, the spruce grouse, was one of the major reasons that he had made the trek. And he ultimately, as Audubon tended to do, harvested some birds in Dennisville, and those were the models that he used when painting his print for the species. When I moved to Maine about 6 years ago, I felt sort of a kindred spirit with Audubon because this species was on my list of things that I wanted to work with and better understand. I wasn't quite as melodramatic about it as Audubon was, but nevertheless, what I'm going to present to you today represents, roughly the last 6 years of effort in my lab trying to better understand how this species lives in the Maine woods. So spruce grouse and grouse in general are a northern hemisphere temperate group of birds. They're typically resident in the ecosystems they inhabit. They don't make long distance migrations. And they're able to do this because they have a suite of adaptations that allow them to persist year-round on a relatively nutrient-poor herbivorous diet. And in the case of spruce grouse, that adaptation is tightly linked with short-needled conifers. So the species spends basically its entire winter dining on nothing but needles of pine, spruce, fir, and other conifer species. And so you can imagine there is this tight link between spruce grouse and conifers, as the name implies. And that's why we tend to see this distribution of spruce grouse shown here, more or less coinciding with the northern boreal forest. And there is a sister species to spruce grouse in the old world, the sharp-winged grouse, that looks, superficially similar but is considered taxonomically distinct, occupies a similar niche. We do coincidentally have another conifer obligate species of grouse in North America, actually two species depicted here. The blue grouse collectively, they were split about a decade ago into two species, dusky grouse and sooty grouse in purple and blue. They're primarily associated with the Rocky Mountains and the Cascades down into the Sierras. But the same general adaptation to winter diets comprised of conifer needles. On the spruce grouse slide, you can see that spruce grouse extend into the southern edge of their range, extending into the continental U.S. or the contiguous U.S. rather, in three different places: the Rocky Mountains to the west, the upper Midwest, and here in the Northeast. So as a conifer specialist distributed throughout North America, in much of their range, their distribution coincides with fire-adapted systems. This is a map depicting the distribution of conifer species with serotinous cones, so cones that require fire as part of their life cycle for germination. And you can see a major chunk of spruce grouse range coincides with jack pine, which is kind of the bright green in the center of this slide. And so across much of their range, spruce grouse inhabit fire-dependent systems. And as such, they've evolved a strategy for living in those fire-adapted systems, and we would expect that the disturbance regimes in those systems could be somehow tied into their life history. Here in Maine, we don't generally think of our forests as being fire-adapted systems. Fire return intervals are generally presumed to be fairly long in most of Maine, over 200 years pre-colonial. fire returns, and I'm not a fire ecologist myself, but I did chat with some people who have good knowledge of this to make sure I wasn't going to say anything that embarrassed myself. And more or less, the thought is that fire was not a major driver of disturbance dynamics, at least in recent history in the state of Maine. One sort of major disturbance factor that we do have, and probably one of the prominent disturbance factors in conifer forests, is periodic insect outbreak through this species, the spruce budworm. This is work from a colleague of mine, Sean Fravor, in the School of Forest Resources here, where he's able to look at tree ring records and document approximately a 65-ish year cyclicity to spruce budworm outbreaks in northern Maine. And I asked Sean the other day, in many systems, insect outbreak would be fairly tightly coupled with wildfire. Why is it that we don't see that here? And his answer to me was that in terms of the spruce budworm, they cause defoliation of their primary host, red spruce, but they don't necessarily cause mortality of the trees. And so you tend to see lower productivity, not necessarily widespread mortality that then would increase dry fuel loads and result in fire. So regardless, the expectation here is that spruce budworm provided a pretty important historic disturbance regimen that probably definitely shaped successional dynamics of our conifer forests, not necessarily in a large-scale stand replacing way. More recently, though, spruce budworm plays into the dynamics of commercial forestry in the state. In the 1970s and 80s, we had our most recent outbreak of spruce budworm. It's depicted in these two figures, which I pulled from the Maine Forest Service. The one on the left shows the uptick in records of spruce budworm in trapping exercises. The series of maps on the right tends to show the spatial footprint of those outbreaks. And one of the consequences of this is it did promote a sort of a widespread response by the forest products industry, which included, both direct salvage logging, some insecticide use to try and control the budworm outbreaks. But as a result of the more active logging practices, it also changed the market dynamics such that there was a legacy where, major markets for softwoods opened up in response to the salvage logging, and so there was a bit of a carryover of widespread clear cutting for a variety of reasons in northern Maine of conifer stands, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the post-harvest management practices that occurred following that. This did actually result, though, in some negative public reaction. There was some regulatory change that I'll talk about a little bit later that now restricts large-scale clear-cutting practices in the state. So overall, much of the present-day landscape in northern Maine is in some way affected by this disturbance legacy associated with the combination of insect outbreak and commercial forest management. And I do see a comment about some fire rotation and frequency in jack pine forests in Maine, and that's probably certainly true. Jack pine definitely has a lower overall footprint in our state relative to spruce and fir. So jumping into our particular study, our study area was located in a portion of northern Maine referred to regionally as the Telos area in the North Maine woods. This is primarily a privately owned commercial forest system, and a small proportion of our study area, roughly 20% of it, was located in the scientific forest management area of Baxter State Park. So Baxter State Park contains Mount Katahdin. It's the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail, and that sits just to the right or the east of the black box on the map here. And I've also shown you the current geographic distribution of spruce grouse within the Northeast, so widely distributed throughout most of the northern two-thirds of Maine, extending into northern New Hampshire and Vermont, and then some isolated populations in the Adirondacks of northern New York. And in our study system, the common conifer forests are primarily dominated by red and black spruce and balsam fir. And then tamarack is present throughout the summer, and also we tend to see that as an important food resource for spruce grouse throughout the year. So we conducted spruce grouse work in this system associated with the 2 graduate student projects I mentioned earlier from 2012 until just last year, 2018. This was primarily a radio-telemetry project. So the female depicted on this slide is wearing a radio necklace. We were able to mark 150 spruce grouse over that 6-year period. And from the radio transmitters, we collected a fair amount of demographic information about these birds. So of those 150 birds, 116 were what we would classify as adult birds. So those are birds in at least their 2nd year of life or later. And the radios gave us information on annual survival of those birds. We were also able to mark 43 what we'll term juvenile birds. These would be birds that were hatched during the present year that they were studied, and we classify them as juveniles once they leave their natal brood and are independent from their mother. And so from those birds, we obtain their survival over their first fall and winter period. We also observed 60 females that were actively tending broods, and from that we will look at annual patterns in brood success. Nests were difficult to find, but we managed to get 26 of them over that period that we could quantify nest survival information from. And then we collected a whole bunch of location data from these marked birds, so walking in with radio antenna and actually observing the spruce grouse on the ground to classify habitat use. I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about the forest management history within our system, and we're going to classify management of conifer stands into 3 different categories that I'm going to go through on these next few slides. And the first of these are going to be what we'll term regenerating clear cuts. So these are areas that had, essentially complete or near complete overstory removal and that are regenerating into a conifer-dominated stand. They have low residual basal area. There's no entry or treatment of the stand following the original harvest. That's going to contrast with the next category we see. And so what this amounts to is a clear cut that has sort of natural regeneration of a conifer-dominant stand without any sort of post-harvest intervention, which means that there are certain site characteristics that are definitely present on these sites that promote conifer-dominant regeneration in the absence of, say, herbicide treatment to kill deciduous stems. Here's an example of a regenerating clear cut. This is Joel Tevenkamp, PhD student on the project. He's getting ready to noose pole a spruce grouse in the stand. And, again, high overstory removal, just, maybe a few standing mature trees still left. A lot of structural diversity and a lot of understory diversity in these regenerating clear cuts. The next stand type that we're going to focus on is what I'm going to refer to as a treated clear cut. In terms of the initial harvest of the stand, it's basically the same as our first category. But in these stands, they received some combination of post-harvest treatment to promote conifer dominance and also growth of primarily spruce, but also fir. So these stands received an aerial treatment of a broad-spectrum herbicide, roughly 5 to 7 to maybe 10 years post-treatment, and that was to depress and limit deciduous regrowth. They were also often entered at some point, often in the 15 to 20 years post-harvest, to do a pre-commercial thinning, so hand thinning to reduce the standing density of trees and improve the growth and yield of the conifers within the stand. This primarily would tend to target deciduous stems or low-quality conifer stems. So you have, through this combination of herbicide and thinning, both a increasing growth of the conifer trees within the stand, and then also a shifting, further shifting away from deciduous presence. This is an example of one pre-commercially thinned stand They tend to be in kind of the pole size age class. As you can see here, you can see a lot of the residual stems laying on the ground from the thinning exercise. They tend to have fairly open understories, not a lot of structural complexity in that understory. And, if you set two common age clear-cut stands side by side, presumably one that received this post-harvest treatment, you would see larger trees on average, because of the release due to the management practice. And then the last stand we're going to look at are what we'll term residual stands. These are stands that have no history of stand entry since at least 1981. 1981 is the last date that the geospatial layers we have available for us to classify all of these stands go. So we can classify stands as having not been harvested in at least, say, the past 35 years. And in the case of the residuals, that's no entry of any sort. In practice, we think that most of these stands probably have not been harvested even since before that 1970s onset of the Spruce Budworm outbreak. The stands that may have been harvested prior to 81 but that received either herbicide or thinning treatments during the 1980s, we have information on. So they fall in that treated clear-cut category, but just sort of a necessary caveat to this, there may be some, relatively speaking, older clear-cuts in this residual stand category. And then another caveat to this is that all stands in this system are, by definition, second growth stands. So we certainly don't have any primary growth forest in the system, and probably not all that accurate to classify anything as old growth, and even, again, some of these stands may be in the 30 to 40 year age, so it's probably debatable whether they would qualify as mature. But regardless, they are distinct structurally and compositionally from the other two categories, which are on average younger and look very different. Here's one example of one of these residual stands that's in the scientific management area of Baxter State Park. Certainly, typically more structural complexity in these stands compared to, say, the treated clear cuts. In many cases, you're starting to see some self-thinning. You're going to see a little bit more of a deciduous component, much more diversity in the mid and understory often. We also see a couple of other characteristics of these stands. Oftentimes, they are residual because they were either not close enough to a road to be worth entering, or they were in another area that had some sort of special protection, like a wetland. So we do see, some of these being on the more old spectrum. They would also include areas like transition zones between lowland black spruce and peat bogs, like you see on the image here on the right-hand side of the screen. So the residual stands are kind of a catch-all category for things that are by no means, representative of what pre-colonization Maine would have looked like, but are definitely much different than our more intensively managed, recently disturbed clear-cut areas. All right. There are other forest types in this system, including, some deciduous-dominated forests. American beech is present in the system. Certainly, your typical northern hardwood mix is present in the system. There are also forest stands that have received what sort of are referred to colloquially in Maine as partial harvest, which would be synonymous with a selection or a partial overstory removal that tend to be a mixed deciduous conifer component. Spruce grouse never used any of these areas with any kind of frequency enough for us to even really start to consider them in the analysis that I'm looking at today. So we're really going to be focusing primarily on those three different flavors of conifer-dominated stands. Here's just a quick representation of what at least the spruce grouse use data look like. Same map image here on both sides of the screen, one of them delineating the stands with the treatment history as provided to us by the management companies, the other being an aerial image of that same stand. I use this as a point just to give a quick rundown of how we treated the habitat use information for this analysis. What we did for each bird and each category for that bird is we looked at proportional use of each of these three treatment types. So how frequently were they found either in a treated clear-cut, an untreated clear-cut, or a residual stand, and classified bird based on the proportion of use locations rather than trying to shoebox them all into, you know, one of those three categories or another. What that allowed us to do, obviously, is acknowledge the fact that birds don't exclusively use one stand type or another, or may switch between stand types depending on the life phase that they're in. We also were able to, with the data we have, look at stand age as years since harvest. We ended up needing to also classify this data because, again, the layers available to us only went back to that early 1980s period. So we classified these into what it can essentially be young, medium, and old age classes. They loosely correspond with sapling, pull, and mature size classes based on the typical growth rates in this system. And, you know, for that matter, they loosely correspond with what we would expect a clear-cut, a treated clear-cut, and a residual stand to look like in terms of age distribution, with some overlap at the edges. But overall, you know, we looked at the proportional use of spruce grouse for different stand age classes, and we just didn't find that they were as strong a predictor of anything we were going to look at compared to treatment types. The treatment type was more useful for classifying the demographics of spruce grouse in the system. And so I mentioned this just to acknowledge the fact that we looked at it, but for the most part, we're going to be focusing on those treatment categories with the analyses we did. All right, so dialing into the spruce grouse population component, we're going to look at 4 different spruce grouse demographic rates. The first is going to be nest survival. From our nest monitoring data, we quantified the daily survival rate of each nest, and then that can be translated into the probability of nest success over a 32-day exposure period, and that would include both the time it takes for a spruce grouse to lay its clutch of, in our system, 5 to 7 eggs, and then the 24 days of incubation that it takes for the nest to hatch. And spruce grouse are ground nesting birds. They leave the nest just following hatch of the young. And so from our telemetry data, we're also going to look at the rate of brood success. In this case, what we did was we looked at, throughout the summer brood rearing period, the weekly probability that a female remained actively tending a brood. So that the females were radio marked, we followed them, we visited them on a week-to-week basis, and quantified whether or not they still had at least one chick. And so the metric we're looking at here is the probability that the female retains the brood. 1 minus that would give us the probability of brood loss. And then what we're going to quantify for brood success overall is over a 10-week period between the hatch of the nest and the point at which we think the young are more or less becoming independent. What's the probability that that female will still have at least one chick present at the end of that time period? From there, we're going to look at what I'll term juvenile survival. Again, that's the survival of the young birds following dispersal of the broods throughout their first fall and overwinter period. This is going to be expressed as a monthly survival probability that we can translate into the cumulative probability that that juvenile will survive from brood breakup in September until the point at which he or she would begin their breeding activities during their first spring. And then once the birds pass that first spring breeding system, we would graduate them into our adult age class, or our after hatch year. And we'll be looking at survival of these birds throughout the entire 12-month annual period based on a monthly survival probability. And I've got these 4 things color-coded. We're going to look at them as results moving forward, and you see the same colors and these same individual icons identifying each of these 4 different vital rates as we move through the results. All right, so the analysis we did, combining all of that data collection that I've covered up until this point, I already explained how we quantified spruce grouse use of our different stand types as proportional use. And we're feeding that into demographic models based on principles of marked recapture to look at the expected response in, say, survival probability as a function of an individual's use of those stand types. We did all the analysis for this in the RMark package in Program R. And then once we quantify each of those 4 individual vital rate survivals and their relationships with the forest stand types, we're going to feed them into a stage-based population model using principles of matrix population modeling a la Caswell. And this is going to be a combination of those 4 different vital rates that we talked about, plus a number of other things like clutch size, nesting rate, et cetera, that we weren't able to link directly to the forest stand use, but that we could derive either from our own data or the literature in order to fully populate this population model. The one piece that's missing from this chain of events here is there's definitely a component of species-habitat relationships related to habitat selection, which basically would ask the question, you know, of these 3 different stand types as I've defined them, you know, do we see spruce grouse using any one of them disproportionately to its availability on the landscape? That's still kind of a work in progress, and it's something that Joel is going to be tackling for his PhD. So I'm largely going to gloss over that for the case of this analysis right here and focus more on the use to demographics to population response chain of events. And what that does is it leaves us with a bit of a caveat we have to recognize here. I can only evaluate the effect of a forest stand on the demographics of spruce grouse if spruce grouse actually exists there. So I can't tell you anything about, say, how deciduous forests affect spruce grouse in this context because our spruce grouse never went into deciduous forests or did so infrequently that it wasn't something we could quantify. Joel will be able to tell us something about how much or how little they avoid some of those other non-target habitat types, but we're starting from the perspective of use here for this analysis. Coincidentally, we're looking at the male and the female here, illustrating their color dimorphism, the female being the one on the left with the radio transmitter. All right, I'm just going to go through a quick overview from a use perspective of what we found, just to give you an idea of how the data that we had from our marked birds distributed across our 3 focal stand types. In terms of nests, again, a fairly modest sample size here, but we saw a relatively even distribution across each of those 3 types of interest, the greatest use in the untreated clear cuts, but again, roughly 20 to 30% use in each of the 3 different stand treatment types. And we also saw relatively mixed use of treatment types during brooding. So what this figure is showing, these are box plots of the proportion of brood locations for each individual brood as they relate to, from left to right, our clear cuts, our treated clear cuts, and our residual stands. The colors here, the colors of the dots in the plot just represent the different years of the study. I only have them in there to illustrate the fact that we tended to see a fairly even spread of values for this across all of our different years of research, which, you know, from a sampling perspective makes me feel good. Slightly higher proportional use of those treated clear cuts by broods, but we still see anywhere from essentially non-use at 0 to almost 100% use up at the upper end of the figure, and a range of values across each of the 3 stand types. So we don't have any real issues with sampling imbalance here. On the juvenile side, we actually saw you know, a relatively speaking higher distribution of juvenile use in those residual stands. So again, this is after they've left their natal brood. And there's, I think, a pretty clear reason why that is that we'll see when we get into the results. But more use of residual stands. But again, we did see certain individuals exhibiting moderate to high use of the other 2 stand types. So we have representation across all 3 stand types for juveniles. And then the same is true of adults. And we do tend to see with adults a little bit of greater use of treated clear cuts relative to the other 2 stand types. but again, representation of individuals across all three. And another necessary caveat to these is primarily the data for adults were collected during the spring, summer, and fall. We had a little bit of a presence in the system during the winter, but we tended to monitor birds more from aircraft with maybe just only periodic access over winter because of access issues due to snow and road closures, et cetera. So our use of treatments by adults is definitely restricted primarily to the breeding season and the fall. And so that's just something to keep in mind in how we interpret results of their analysis. All right, now we can get into the effects on each of the different demographic rates, and we do find that stand type has a measurable effect in each case, and we'll start with nests. So the clearest result here was that nests that were located in those treated clear-cut stands had a lower daily nest survival probability compared to all other stand types. And this was the only stand type that stood out in that respect. Again, this is the smallest sample size we have among our different data sets. So there is a bit of a caution necessitated in this interpretation, but still, pretty substantial reduction in nest survival for the sample of nests in treated clear cuts. Adult spruce grouse actually had a positive effect on their monthly survival probability related to untreated clear cuts. So as adults made greater use of the clear cuts that had not received that intensive post-harvest treatment, we tended to see them have a higher monthly survival probability that translated into a greater annual rate of survival for those birds. So differing effects of clear cut here on nesting versus adult survival, but the type of clear cut differed. Treated clear cuts for nest, untreated clear cuts with a positive effect for adults. And then when we look at our brood success rate and our juvenile survival probabilities, this is where we see those residual forest stands starting to play a role in the demographics, but in opposing ways. So broods that made greater use of those residual forest stands had a higher weekly brood survival rate and a greater overall brood success. So it's a positive effect of residual forest stand use for broods. Hatchier or juvenile birds showed the opposite effect, negative effect of use of those residual stands. So there's a few catches here. These are not necessarily direct effects of the habitat that the brood was raised in. We're able to mark some of our chicks from our previously marked hens, but we also opportunistically marked other hatchier birds or other juvenile birds. So I'm not necessarily saying that the spot the hen chose for her brood was bad for the offspring. And actually, the way that the social dynamics of grouse work is once the broods break up, the hatchier birds tend to move out and through the process of dispersal seek new habitat. So it's not a one-to-one relationship here. But when I mentioned earlier that we saw greater use of residual stands by juvenile birds, given that there is a positive effect of those residual stands on brood success, it's totally in the realm of possibilities that with chicks being imprinted on that habitat type, that they tend to favor it when they are now independent and seeking their own way in the world. And so part of this negative effect of residual forest on juveniles could be tied up in a density-dependent relationship or something along that nature. We can't really delve too much in the mechanism there other than to just say their first fall and winter juvenile birds that we found associated with residual stands had lower survival, and so there is a bit of an offsetting relationship here where the same stand type is having a positive effect at one life stage and a negative effect at another life stage. Taking a little bit of a step back here, what we are looking at on the lower edge of this slide is just the annual estimates of those three different survival rates that we've been talking about, only to illustrate that there was a fair amount of variability in the system. And in the table at the top, we have the actual estimates of the overall success or survival rate for the entire study, just to point out that, things like brood success, we went from some years when almost every brood was successful to some years when only a quarter of the broods were successful. And we see similar scopes of variation for juvenile and adult survival. We didn't have any juveniles marked during the first 2 years of the study, so that's limited to just the 4 annual estimates. But overall, variation is present in this system, and it's variation that is probably independent in some way of habitat type, because it's going to be related to things like weather. From our population model we constructed, if we calculate an annual population growth rate for each study year, we only found one of the 6 with a positive population growth rate, so that would be a rate greater than 1. A couple of years that, 1 year that was the first year of the study, approaching 1, and the little asterisk on that population growth rate for those first 2 years in the upper right is to signify that we're lacking juvenile survival estimates for those years, so I had to use the mean value, and that's a caveat. Higher juvenile survival during those early years could have easily bumped one or both of those annual estimates up to greater than 1. Overall, though, when we look at mean vital rates from the system over the 6-year period, we see a population growth rate of, just over 0.7. If we plug that into a stochastic simulation model, it tells us that the confidence intervals don't overlap a value of 1. And so we would say that our demographic data, as we've collected it, is predictive of overall decline in this system. From there, we can use some techniques to start to ask questions about how each of those individual vital rates, as well as some of the ones that we either had to rely on literature or were not stand specific, contribute to that annual growth rate. So this would be using techniques referred to as sensitivity analysis and elasticity analysis. I'm going to show the elasticity results here. And the take home from this is just we're looking at, of all of the vital rates that we've measured, what is their potential to change the population growth rate? So if we proportionally increase or decrease any of these, how do we expect population growth to respond? And you'll see there's a whole suite of values down here. Again, they're color-coded to represent the different life phase that we're talking about. And the take-home here is that overwhelmingly adult survival has the greatest potential to affect population growth. Interestingly, you'll see that all of the blue bars here are all characteristics associating with nesting. One of those we quantified directly from our data. That was the nest survival rate or nest success rate. But nests also have clutch sizes. Not every bird attempts to nest necessarily. Sometimes if they lose a nest, they will try again, and not every bird attempts to do that. And so there's a bunch of different individual component rates associated with nesting. And so in some ways, and the same is true of our brooding period, we quantified brood success, and then we had some estimate of how many chicks the broods had at the end of the summer, so we could look at the aggregate of those to get at the actual production of chicks. So when we aggregate these together, it paints a slightly different picture. All of those individual component vital rates associated with nesting actually make them have a higher contribution, nesting that is as a whole, to the population growth rate, slightly more so than adult survival. So all it is just to say that adult survival and nesting in aggregate are the two things that we think have at least the greatest potential to affect the future dynamics of the species, and less so with brood success and the least so with hatch year survival. But to take that a step further, we've also got these established relationships now with our different stand types. And we can start to ask the question then, not only how do the different forest treatments affect the individual vital rate, but how does that vital rate trickle up to a potential to affect population growth? And this is important because when we look at these different effects, they all have different slopes. And so you could potentially have a demographic rate like hatch year survival that makes a lower potential contribution to the population growth rate. But if it has a really strong relationship to, say, a forest management strategy, then you might actually have a greater effect on growth because of the combination of those two things. And so to start to take a look at this, what I did is I took each of the 4 vital rates we've looked at, and I estimated what the expected survival probability would be for, in the case of a negative effect, really low use of that stand type, and in the case of a positive effect, really high use of the stand type. So this would essentially be like if we were to go into the system and manipulate it such that we increased availability and increased use of, say, a positive associated stand type, how does that affect the population growth rate? And then we can feed those back into our population model and look at how the expected outcomes change. And it paints only a slightly different picture than what the elasticity analysis does. It still tells us that adult survival is really important because of the combination of the strong positive effect of regenerating clear cuts on adult survival and their overall contribution to population growth rate. But it also tells us that the positive use of residual stands by broods, also has a pretty strong moderate effect on population growth rate. So the y-axis on this figure, how much does population growth go up if we assume that either positive or non-use of stands, depending on their effect direction. And so, we had that opposing relationship between brood survival and hatch year survival between orange and green here. The negative effect on juveniles had a quite a bit lower overall influence on expected growth rate compared to the positive effect of those residual stands for brood survival. So if we were to look at, what are 2 ways that a manager could potentially positively affect spruce grouse, the prevalence of residual stands for brood rearing and untreated clear cuts for adults are probably 2 of those methods. All right, so I'm going to give a quick summary of everything we just talked about, and then I promise we're going to come back to fire and interpret some of these results in the theme of fire. So I think our results show that the relationship between the stand, harvest, or disturbance history and the different vital rates of spruce grouse is varied. And as a result, and because we sometimes see even opposing effects of a certain stand type on a particular vital rate, habitat heterogeneity is probably a key to meet resource needs for spruce grouse across their full life cycle. And for grouse in general, this is a common theme and not necessarily something that's terribly earth-shattering, although perhaps not necessarily demonstrated for this species to this extent in the past. Well, we do say and interpret that it seems that future population decline in this system in particular, and perhaps for spruce grouse across the state, is likely. And this matches basically every other recent assessment of the species at the southern extent of their range. So researchers in Wisconsin have demonstrated using similar methods to what I presented here, a kind of remarkably similar population growth rate to what we found. And then here in the Northeast, Angie Ross in New York worked on 40 years of data and demonstrated 70% loss of occupied area by spruce grouse in the Adirondacks. And I worked with an undergraduate student here at the University of Maine recently. We conducted a resurvey of some historically monitored stands on Mount Desert Island, so Acadia National Park in southern Maine. We showed a 50% decline in occupancy, decrease in apparent abundance, and then you couple that with our results from northern Maine of expected population decline and not painting the rosiest of picture for this species at their southern range extent. We also expect that there is going to be regional shifts in forest composition in Maine, largely due to regulatory changes and harvest strategies. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Part of the response to that historic harvest following the Spruce Budworm outbreak was that the state of Maine restricted the overall size of clearcutting, and that's led to a shift towards different harvest techniques to leave greater amounts of standing residual area. I'm showing that here on the satellite image. You can see this sort of herringbone pattern in the forest. That's where they've entered with a mechanized harvester. The harvester rows are the herringbones, and they selectively harvest from the inner space within them. This tends to, all things being equal, which they almost never are, tends to produce a more mixed forest type with a greater amount of deciduous, and we don't necessarily expect spruce grouse to use those types of stands. Some of the work done here at the University of Maine has predicted somewhere between 2.5% and 5% of the current mature conifer stands are harvested using this technique annually. And again, based on the greater promotion of deciduous regeneration, we essentially think that this will result in conversion to non-habitat for spruce grouse. And so what this means for future population persistence is kind of unclear. One of the directions I'd like to go in my research program is to start to think about these larger geospatial processes and how we might be able to use the fine-scale demographic information we have to predict how land use change will affect populations at a larger scale. All right, so this wasn't a study of spruce grouse in a fire-dominated system, but I was hoping to leave you at least with some predictions that could be tested in fire-dependent systems where fire is the major disturbance agent. We see and believe that spruce grouse depend on heterogeneous forests with varying stand types and structures to meet all of their different life history requirements. And so in a fire-adapted system, I would think that local heterogeneity in fire effects are probably going to be fairly critical. One prediction might be that you do need periodic stand replacing fires that result in early to mid-successional conifer regrowth across the landscape, which would have a benefit to survival of adults. But at the same time, this probably suggests that you want to have retention of some residual, more mature forest in some proximity to those high-intensity areas for the benefit of your brood rearing. And one example that I found with a quick perusal of the literature from the upper Midwest, this case of jack pine stringers following fire, so remnant patches of jack pine within a larger burned matrix, and the authors of this work said that the occurrence of these stringers depended on relatively large-scale, relatively high-intensity fires, and the prevalence of stringers and their total footprint became more frequent as you increased fire size on the landscape. So this is one potential where I would expect that a scenario like this would have a stronger positive effect on spruce grouse populations, whereas smaller scale fires, maybe not so much, but the caveat to that is, designing a landscape that interspersed small-scale, high-intensity fire with remnant residual forest patches might result in the same outcome. So the heterogeneity and how it is left seems to be key. In terms of our other vital rates, the negative effect we saw of that high-intensity pre-commercial thinning, that was a fairly artificial stand type in our system. I'm not sure it necessarily relates, to a fire-dependent system. So I wouldn't really necessarily predict much relevance of nest success in that scenario, but I could be proven wrong. And we would, I guess, expect to see the same sort of offsetting effect of those more mature residual stands on juvenile survival. But based on a lot of the, sensitivity analysis we did, we didn't see juvenile survival as a major player in population growth rate. So maybe not. But this is definitely a life phase among galliform birds, really among birds in general, that has received the lowest attention, in part because it's one of the hardest things to study. And so there's definitely room for more work here. And I would say that, clearly a major caveat to all of this is that there are definitely factors other than forest structure that affect spruce grouse populations, things like predator communities, landscape composition, et cetera. So, it's not quite as simple as being able to just say that fire is an issue, or sorry, that's not what I meant to say. It's not quite as simple as saying that the habitat structure resulting from fire is the only thing that you're going to expect to see in terms of variation among systems. All right, so I can wrap up here, and by just saying that grouse in general and spruce grouse in particular are tightly linked with ecosystem function, and that inextricably connects them to successional processes in conifer forest, without question. And in much of their range, fire is a pretty significant player in spruce grouse habitat population relationships. In a largely fire-free system like we have, we find that the relationships between the different types of disturbance is nuanced, and we expect the same to be true in a fire-dependent system. And there are examples of detailed studies of spruce grouse in response to fire. They do tend to be either 30 to 40 years old, which isn't to say that they're not useful. They're just not recent. They tend to be short-term and focused on direct effects, like what did we see this population do after our forest burned, not necessarily looking at the legacy of fire in the system. And there are some good studies with some information to glean that are tied up in larger studies of avian community dynamics, which are useful but not necessarily species-specific. I do think there's a lot of potential to learn more about the role of fire and its effect on forests with this species. And so I'll close up here by just acknowledging, certainly all the groups that gave us access to their property and helped with the logistics of the project, small army of field technicians and volunteers, the funding sources that I mentioned earlier, and if you have any questions about this work, you can feel free to contact me through any of the variety of media on there on the bottom. And I would be happy to take any questions. And I see they're already pouring in.
Yes. Yeah, we're all set for this. So thank you, Erik. All right, so I want to jump up and had Bill Patterson ask a couple questions right near the start. Actually, part of it was a comment, so go ahead.
Yeah, and I think I tried to sort of hit Bill's first question on the fly, and definitely acknowledging that there are spruce grouse and jack pine forests in Maine, and totally expect that those could have been fire-dependent systems. And in fact, if we toggle off my acknowledgement slide here to this photo, this is a female that was on Great Wass Island standing in a jack pine. So point well taken there. And to answer your question about proximity to Orono, the closest I have seen them, if you remember the local geography, is along the county road, which is about 5 miles of the grouse flies from University of Maine campus here. They also tend to be out in the Orono Caribou Bog area. So yeah, they're still definitely here. Southern range limit, they are still present on Mount Desert Island and Acadia National Park. So we're kind of sitting right at their southern south, sort of the southwestern terminus of their main distribution. And then from Nick, hi Nick. Let's see, let me read this. Strip cuts nearby, would you say that spruce grouse are generally avoiding strip cut areas and advocating them for stop doing that to black spruce? Yeah, I mean, I think they will, in our system, it's a bit tough to say because it tends to be very conifer dominated, and so I would think it depends a little bit on what those look like. If they are adjacent to other spruce fir dominated stands, I would expect to see them using them. If they are just a narrow strip surrounded by a more deciduous matrix, maybe not so much. and you know, I guess for full disclosure, I mean, I've spent a fair amount of time up on the ground there, but you know, as things tend to go, the graduate students had much more boots on the ground effort there, so they could probably give you a little bit more insight based on their direct experience. Scott asks about capture method. Yeah, Scott, we pretty much primarily use noose poles. We experimented a little bit with a handheld net gun, but these things, you know, a noose pole, it's not 100% by any means, but it's a pretty darn effective way to catch spruce grouse. They're called, you know, fool hen in a lot of areas because they're docile and pretty willing to let you approach them, and it's definitely not always a sure thing. The biggest issue we would run into is they would, you know, fly too high in a tree, and either we couldn't reach them or we're too concerned about the safety of the birds to pulling them out of the tree. On some of the rough grouse work that we've done here in central Maine, we've caught spruce grouse in our walk-in traps. Those tend to be a lot more labor intensive though, and so we stuck with the noose poles. I would not be surprised at all, Bill, given, you know, the initial colonization and harvest of the Maine woods after you start to see a big human footprint. Like for example, and I'll give you a caveat to this on Mount Desert Island, where we were studying spruce grouse in black spruce lowland stands. I mentioned that there had been about a 50% decline in stand occupancy. 3 of the 4 stands where we still see spruce grouse on MDI are in the footprint of a very large wildfire that happened in the 1940s that was human started in Bar Harbor and burned, you know, something like a third of the island. And so, yeah, definitely local examples of fire history. I'm not aware of any recent fire history in our study system in northern Maine, though. Let's see, moving into different stands in winter. My anecdotal answer to your question there, Nick, is that they actually probably use those pre-commercially thinned stands more than we are reflecting in our data during the winter time. The times that I were up in the field over winter, you know, they spend most of the winter in our system sitting about 10 to 15 feet up in a red spruce, and it tended to be in the middle of fairly contiguous dense stands, which I would, you know, again, given the volume of relatively recently harvested and regenerating conifers in our system, I would expect potentially different behavior than what you guys might see in the Midwest. But yeah, you know, again, access being what it was and the overall objectives of the project being more tightly linked towards the reproductive component, we definitely don't have a great handle on the winter ecology, which is something I would like to know more about for sure.
And Nick's responded to you too.
Sweet.
Birds with decent canopy said apple and black spruce in the Midwest. All right. Folks, if you got any more questions, please type them in the chat box. Give a few minutes just to make sure we don't miss any. I'm going to flip to the last slide just to kind of announce the next webinar, and then we'll see if there's any final questions. Okay, Eric?
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks.
Sure. So just again, I want to highlight our ongoing webinar series. The next one we have is scheduled for March 27th. I realize on the slide I didn't put the time, but it is at 1 p.m. Central, so 2 p.m. Eastern. And this is actually a rescheduled webinar. This webinar was originally supposed to be in January, but due to government shutdown issues, we wisely decided to postpone it. And this one's going to be highlighting 2 of our funded intern projects. One is going to be seasonal burning to improve management for brush-dependent species. And the other you can see is effects of fire restoration, pine woodland, looking at culturally important species such as low bush and velvet leaf blueberry. So you can join us for that. There's also information up on the website with that. It's possible we could have an additional webinar on March 28th, but we are seeing if the 28th date in March is going to work or if we move that into April. So for sure, the March 27th one here, the one that's listed here is our next webinar. So take a look for that. And we'll bounce back to this because I like this picture better for big grouse. I'm not seeing any additional questions. There's a lot of thanks. So I guess, Erik, any last parting words?
No, I don't think so. Thanks a lot. I'm glad to have the opportunity to present this work.
Yeah, and we're very pleased too. Excellent webinar. So again, thanks, Erik, and everyone for joining us online. For anybody who wants to review this webinar or share it with someone else, we are making a recording of the webinar. I'll get that up on the Lake States Fire Science Consortium website. That should be a little later today. And if we go up in the chat box here for those, all the way to the top, there's the webinar link. Otherwise, you can go to the webinar for today, and that'll become archived so that this recording in the PDF is always available. So with that, not seeing any other questions, again, a big thank you, Erik, and we'll wrap this up.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jack.
All right. Thanks, guys.